This video will contain spoilers for the following: Life is Strange Before the Storm. Please be mindful of the following content warnings: discussions and depictions of misogyny, discussions and depictions of misogynistic violence, discussions and depictions of ableism, needle drug use, discussions of drug use and addiction, discussions of alcoholism and binge drinking, discussions of queerphobia and lesbophobia, and smoking, some of which will be depicted on screen. Life is Strange has arguably been my favorite video game series ever since I was 19. I got into it late for some reason, having weird reservations about playing the game at first, even though tons of people were raving about it online. I have a tendency to be very apprehensive when trying new things, so I didn't play the first game until 2019, but when I did, I instantly fell in love. It's a very rare thing for a piece of media to make me feel so safe, so seen. I hadn't really engaged with any video games that had explicitly queer characters in them before, let alone sapphic characters, and I was immediately sucked in by the depth and power of Chloe and Max's relationship, even if a lot of it is more subtext than text, which is annoying, but I would argue that there is an inherent value in subtextual queer experiences. A lot of it can feel very genuine, and true to our early lives, where you're still circling in on the truth, playing off certain interactions as jokes or dares, to avoid engaging with the painful reality of your genuine feelings for another girl, is a very common sapphic experience. But the thing that I loved most of all about Life is Strange was Chloe Price, a very polarizing character in the fandom. It seems most people either love her or hate her, and there's no in between. And it really isn't surprising to me among which demographics these opinions seem to be split. But nevertheless, my experience with experiencing Chloe in this first game for the first time was complicated, largely because in many ways I was staring at parts of myself I had spent my entire life grappling with, or trying to ignore. I was looking at this angry, emotional, intense queer girl, displaying every inch of herself to Max and to you as the player, and I was feeling. I was feeling things I very much did not want to be feeling, because I was being confronted with the many pieces of my insides I had spent a lifetime gathering shame and resentment over. In many ways, in Chloe, I was looking at a reflection of myself. My disabled self, my mentally ill self, the girl who says the things they aren't supposed to say and unapologetically takes up space, only to take it all back moments later. Because the things people say, the way they perceive you, it adds up. It takes a toll. Now, I didn't play Before the Storm until 2 years ago, for a number of reasons that rapidly start to feel more and more like bullshit as I look back on them. The truth is, for the most part, I think I was scared. I didn't want to be confronted with those same feelings Chloe gave me in the previous game, and I didn't want to have to examine them. Because if I was forced to examine them, then I would be forced to acknowledge something I had been denying for so long, something I had been casually dismissing and belittling with jokes and offhand remarks, or shoving away somewhere deep inside myself. Through Chloe, through this messy, complicated girl, I would be forced to acknowledge my own humanity. And that brings a plethora of issues if you're me. Because if you acknowledge yourself as a person, not a monster, not a problem, not something broken or wrong, then you have to acknowledge that the way you've been treated your entire life, the way you've been allowing yourself to be treated, is fundamentally unfair and inexcusable. A lot of said treatment, both of Chloe and myself, has to do with how disabled people, specifically neurodivergent people, particularly neurodivergent women, are treated in our society. And both Life is Strange and its prequel make an effort to critically engage with this, and how these factors, as well as other factors of queerphobia and classism, shape Chloe's experiences, as well as analyzing themes of misogyny and the male gaze as a whole. But I want to focus on Before the Storm in particular, and how this game engages with narrative and truth. Specifically, who gets to decide what the truth is, and who is believed. Essentially, Before the Storm isn't just about ableism and misogyny, both on a structural and personal level and how they interact. But this game is about certain types of narratives that are told about certain kinds of women, and how that story changes depending on who's talking, depending on who is telling the story. Or more specifically, this game is about what I like to call neuromisogyny, and the politics of a narrative. Okay, so neuromisogyny is a word I honestly think I might have invented, because I've never heard anyone use it before. However, if I'm wrong about this, feel free to correct me in the comments. The term neurosexism exists, but that is something completely different than what I am discussing. I use the term neuromisogyny to refer to the intersection of ableism and misogyny, specifically the ableism directed at neurodivergent people. The ableism neurodivergent people experience is often referred to as saneism. Neuromisogyny refers to the way autistic girls and people who are assigned female at birth are told from a young age to smile and be polite, training us to force down our autistic nature in the name of performing our supposed gender correctly. We are more likely to mask because of the social expectations forced on us, although this is also true for trans girls and people of color of various genders. And we are less likely to be diagnosed due to sexist bias in the medical field, as well as the fact that most doctors and so-called autism experts do not know how to identify masking. It's the whole crazy ex-girlfriend trope. It's the manic pixie dream girl trope. I came up with this term because I was discussing with a friend of mine who is also an autistic woman the specific ways in which autistic women are treated by society and how it feels like a completely different branch of ableism from the generic kind that autistic people in general face. Due to the way misogyny mixes in and people's perceptions of gender and how gender is supposed to work, autistic women are often given this very particular, hard to pin down brand of misogyny and ableism that can be hard to properly explain or identify unless you are experiencing that specific thing. So I decided that I wanted to create a word for it. And I think that what I was describing in these conversations with my friend can also be applied to a lot of other women and people who are perceived by society as such, who have a lot of other different types of neurodivergencies, such as borderline and ADHD, OCD, etc. But all of that being said, I think it's important to recognize that neuromisogyny can technically target basically any woman who is emoting or acting in a way that is deemed inappropriate by society. Neurodivergent women are more likely to be targets of this, and those of us who present in ways associated with womanhood. But any woman or person shoved in that category based on society's perceptions can be hurt by it. Insanity for so long has been used as a way to discredit minorities. Hysteria existed as a diagnosis basically meant to punish women for having feelings that men didn't like or didn't want to understand. And it's convenient to be able to point and say, oh, but they aren't crazy, as a means for defending their right to speak and be heard, or simply their right to just exist. But some of us are actually crazy, depending on how you define that word. And crazy shouldn't mean we get our humanity and autonomy stripped away from us. Neuromisogyny also refers to the fact that BPD is overwhelmingly more diagnosed in women than men, although most stats don't take into account how many non-binary people might be diagnosed as well. Some women even argue that borderline personality disorder is just a modern-day hysteria diagnosis, designed to punish women for having complex feelings that men don't want to deal with. Now, I personally don't have BPD, as far as I know, but I know a lot of women and non-binary people with BPD, specifically autistics with BPD, have pushed back against this idea, which makes sense. Autistic women and non-binary people are much more likely to have to fight for their diagnosis and to be seen as actually autistic, although it's true that this can also apply to trans men as well. So it makes sense that After all of that, and also being accused of faking their autism on multiple occasions, they probably wouldn't take too kindly to people saying they didn't have BPD because BPD is made up. However, I would invite all of you to consider that technically all psychiatric disorders are made up, as in someone had to observe a bunch of traits in multiple people, observe those things were both, quote, abnormal, unquote, and often occurred together, and then give it an official name and put it in the DSM in order for it to be recognized as an official mental disorder. And the process of who they choose to observe and why is absolutely biased, and based in societal ideas of what is and isn't normal for certain people, and oppressive power structures. This does not mean that your experiences of having certain feelings and thoughts, or processing the world in a certain way, or displaying certain behaviors isn't real. Of course it is. But the idea that it is completely independent from society and structures of power is made up. Mental illness and disability are social constructs, which does not mean that they are not real. But our idea of what they are is socially constructed based on the society that we live in. If you want more information on this topic, I highly recommend watching Alexander Avila's video essay titled "TikTok Gave Me Autism: The Politics of Self-Diagnosis." I will be linking it down below. Psychiatry is a deeply flawed institution, often used to hurt people who are marginalized through control and violence. The violence of institutionalization, the violence of being separated from your children, or the violence of being barred from entering certain countries, which are some of the many reasons why some people seek to abolish psychiatry entirely. I have mixed feelings about this, which I won't be fully exploring in today's video. And I will of course point out that none of this will work without abolishing capitalism and other oppressive systems of power. But I would argue people have found comfort and meaning in those labels. The autistic community is one based on shared experiences, and often shared trauma, and embracing your differences and the way your mind works. Also, once you know what's up with you, why you struggle with certain things that most people don't, or struggle more than most, then you can come up with the appropriate solutions for how to manage that. The trick is to work with your brain instead of punishing yourself for not being a certain way or being able to do things a certain way. Unfortunately, diagnosis is the only way some people can access certain accommodations or funding. You cannot gain access to disability funding from the government or medication if you do not have an official diagnosis. For autism specifically, you can only access or afford certain therapies if you have a diagnosis. And for some people, some form of autism therapy or speech therapy is beneficial, depending on a person's support needs. I do not, never have, and never will support ABA, but ABA isn't the only autism therapy. I personally saw someone who helped me improve my motor skills when I was a kid, as well as a therapist who helped me grasp a better understanding of facial expressions and social cues. However, a lot of this is unfair because it's focused around having to learn how to understand and speak allistic or neurotypical, when they never try and understand how to speak autistic. It's their game and their rules, and we have to play in order to survive. This goes double for autistics of color, who are often in danger of police violence and in greater danger of being institutionalized if they don't mask, and sometimes still if they do. Simply put, we live in a society that has unfair rules, and in order to gain access to the support we need, as well as gain protection from discrimination, not that it always works, mind you, we need to play the game of psychiatry and receive a diagnosis. We often need to use labels to politically organize around them and seek out community. Moving on now, another term we need to define is neurodivergent. Neurodivergent is a term that was created to encompass all mental disabilities, and mental illness is included in this because mental illnesses are disabilities. The term neurodivergent can be used to refer to anyone who has autism, ADHD, bipolar, OCD, PTSD, a personality disorder, Down syndrome, a learning disability, or basically anyone who isn't neurotypical. The final term we need to define is ableism. Now, ableism is defined as discrimination and prejudice against people with disabilities. I will be perfectly honest with you. I do not understand the difference between ableism and disableism. People have tried to explain it to me before, and I just never seem to get it. I think, hilariously, this is in large part due to my disability, and the fact that autistic people struggle with communication and understanding people. I often need someone to explain something to me multiple times before I actually get it, and even then, sometimes I just won't. So, for the purposes of this video, I will just be using ableism. I'm sorry if that annoys some people. A lot of people in the fandom subscribe to the headcanon that Chloe Price has borderline personality disorder, and I gotta say, I really do see where they're coming from. It was something that has been pointed out by multiple people with BPD in the fandom, but I personally was first made aware of it when I watched the Game Assist video on Life is Strange titled The Price of Life, Disability, Gender, and Agency in Life is Strange, which is a fantastic video, by the way. You should definitely go watch it after you finish watching this one. Now, you already know my less than favorable feelings about psychiatry, but that doesn't mean that using those labels can't ever be useful in describing certain experiences, especially when we are discussing a fictional character. So, technically, the definition of borderline personality disorder is as follows: a mental illness that severely impacts a person's ability to manage their emotions. This loss of emotional control can increase impulsivity, affect how a person feels about themselves, and negatively impact their relationships with others. Anyone who is borderline or has BPD, please feel free to weigh in on how accurate you feel that is to your personal experiences, because I know personally I have major beef with how autism is described in the DSM. Now, originally, when I was writing this script back in January of 2023, I was going to list the diagnostic criteria for BPD and point out all the ways that Chloe fits the DSM-5 criteria. But as my politics slowly became more and more anti-psych over time, I decided against it, because for a number of reasons, a lot of which I have already discussed in this video, I don't think it really matters what the DSM says. What matters is human lived experience. What matters is all the people who have BPD who can point to a character and say, they're just like me, I do that. It may be more politically useful to just describe Chloe as disabled, mentally ill, or neurodivergent, but I think that it can be helpful to have a distinct label that seems to fit her experience pretty well. And I also understand how important it is to have a character who is like you, who has the same label as you. So I completely understand the people with BPD who choose to label Chloe in this way. There is, however, something to be said about how I think a lot of people feel the need to hold the Chloe has BPD card up as a defensive shield against those who would unfairly attack her. And while I can understand where this impulse comes from, because I have it too, it may be worth looking at why, in general, our society has such a strong tendency to demonize anger, intensity, and messiness in women in particular. We could say that Chloe is a traumatized, grieving teenage girl who makes mistakes and sometimes says the wrong thing, and often instead of being given grace or compassion, people seek to demonize and despise her. That is political, just like psychiatry in general is political, because the way we view emotion and behavior as a society is absolutely biased. Therefore, psychiatry is biased. And it says a lot about how our society works, that unacceptable behavior can become much more unacceptable if it is found within a woman instead of a man. Or even that perfectly acceptable behavior can become unacceptable when it is found within a woman. And this targets those who are traditionally more likely to exhibit traits that our society deems unacceptable, essentially neurodivergent people. So fundamentally, I would argue that my main point is that this way of viewing not only Chloe as a neurodivergent character, as a disabled character, but viewing the narrative itself as one surrounding a disabled character is incredibly significant regarding the way her character is framed in both Life is Strange and Before the Storm, as well as how the narrative surrounding her works. And the way so many characters treat and view Chloe is loaded with ableism, particularly neuromisogyny. And hilariously, you see this in the way many in the fandom view her as well. This judgment of a particular type of person, usually more specifically a particular type of woman, who is deemed undesirable or inherently bad TM, hurts so many neurodivergent people, especially neurodivergent women. Chloe, throughout both games, is framed as a problem. She is seen by David, Principal Wells, other students, and even sometimes her own mother as a misbehaving teen, and nothing more. Because they don't understand why she's doing the things she's doing, and why she can't just suck it up and fall in line, or they don't care to understand. They see her the way most neurodivergent teenagers are viewed, in my experience, as just a troublemaker, a problem child, a slacker, having a bad attitude, etc. You see this a lot with lines such as, Chloe chose to stay angry, from Joyce in the first game. Neurodivergent kids are seen as choosing to behave badly, slack off, and not follow the rules, because that's just how teenagers are, or they're just fundamentally bad people. And it's particularly gendered as well. If you think about the way women are demonized for their anger in ways that white men aren't. Chloe isn't just seen as a problem, she's seen as a bitch. A crazy bitch. And it's clear in the narrative that so many people, especially men, see Chloe as needing to know her place in a way that is very gendered. Honestly, the amount of times in Before the Storm alone that she receives very gendered and ableist insults is very telling in my opinion. Not to mention the way she receives very gendered and ableist violence as well from men in both the first game and Before the Storm. Like seriously, the amount of times she's hit, kicked, grabbed, threatened with violence, or literally shot by men in both games is actually quite staggering, but depressingly enough, probably not surprising. People with a mental health related disability, i.e. neurodivergent people, are more likely to be victims of violence, especially women. This is just another textbook example of neuromisogyny. Chloe is clearly depressed and still reeling from her dad's death. To make matters worse, her mother has moved on with someone new, who is a total asshole to Chloe. Instead of actively engaging with her daughter's pain and communicating honestly with her about it, one-on-one, she accuses Chloe of not trying and pushes her to move on Joyce's terms. Then there's also the David of it all. It probably would have been hard to see her mother with anyone new, but David just being so, well, David, really does not help. He seeks to control and police her for the sake of, quote-unquote, her own good. But what he fails to realize is that control isn't love. Chloe mentions in her diary, and we see this in the bonus episode as well, that one of the things she loved most about her dad is that he treated her like an equal. We see examples of this in Farewell, the bonus episode, when Chloe messes with the chemistry stuff of another girl who is essentially targeting her for being poor. William points out that it sounds like Chloe was just sticking up for herself, and the school should look into what the other girl was doing. He had so much faith in her, and actually stuck up for her, which is a startling contrast to Joyce and David later on. David wants to treat her like a criminal for doing drugs and breaking curfew, but neither he nor Joyce ever seem to consider why she's doing these things, or attempt to have a genuine conversation with her that doesn't sound like an interrogation. And honestly, this is just so typical. When you're a neurodivergent teenager, or honestly sometimes just a teenager in general, there's always this assumption of the worst. So many times in my life, instead of actually trying to understand why I was making certain decisions, the adults in my life would just punish and lecture me. People assume teenagers are either just lazy or rude or moody or whatever serves their ableist narrative. Joyce occasionally does seem like she's trying. And depending on which dialogue options you pick in the previous episode, Joyce will be more willing to stick up for Chloe in conversations with David or Wells. But I find it interesting that in order to get Joyce to be more sympathetic, you need to side with her in the conversation about giving David a chance. In order to get Joyce to see how unfair people like Wells and David are being, you need to center Joyce's feelings and push down your own. And that seems unfair. Also, she often brings David into conversations with her and Chloe, and that naturally puts Chloe's guard up. Chloe is in pain, and she's trying to drown it out by self-medicating. And even Chloe herself acknowledges this in her diary. But Joyce would rather see it as rebellious behavior, instead of actually listening to her daughter and acknowledging she's still grieving and having a hard time healing. Joyce is focusing on making herself happy, and moving on even at the expense of her daughter's feelings, which obviously makes Chloe's abandonment issues even worse. And then that leads to her quote-unquote worsening behavior. It honestly seems like Joyce is just starting to view Chloe as an obstacle to her healing and her happiness. The way she speaks to her in episode 1, calling Chloe a problem, saying that she misses her and needs her daughter back, is so dehumanizing and upsetting. Chloe didn't go anywhere. She's right there. And Joyce is the one pushing her away with her choices. The way David in particular speaks to and treats Chloe is pretty misogynistic, calling her girly, which reminds me of when men call you young lady or something else weirdly gendered and uncomfortable for no reason. At first I thought the only reason I disliked being called very gendered things was because I'm non-binary, but a lot of cis women seem to really dislike this as well. He mansplains to her how cars work, even though she tells him point blank that she knows what a spark plug does, and makes remarks like, why do women take forever to get ready? He also just speaks to her in a very condescending way that drips with misogyny and ableism, especially with his whole attitude towards her doing drugs and calling her a loser for getting suspended, or expelled from Blackwell, depending on how you play the game. David goes on and on about respect, but he never does anything to actually genuinely earn it from Chloe, arguably until episode 5 of Life is Strange. He may claim to love her, but it never feels genuine to me because real love isn't fostered on demands and attempts to control a person. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Chloe's still grieving and going through a lot, mental illness and trauma-wise, so school isn't really her priority anymore. Joyce points out that she used to love to learn, which is true. In both the bonus episode and the first episode of Before the Storm, Chloe's love of science is referenced.
Okay, you say you love science, but you are failing chemistry.
You're saying failing chemistry means I hate science?
Or that Blackwell doesn't inspire your best work.
It's interesting that Rachel brings this up because she's right, and it's something most people don't consider or care about in general. Chloe is the kind of person who really doesn't mesh well with the traditional school system, a school system that is generally very inaccessible to neurodivergent people as a whole, as it focuses primarily on memory and test scores rather than actually learning things. Chloe is smart, but she's smart in a way that isn't usually appreciated by the school system or by our society as a whole. Our society doesn't take too kindly to people who don't color inside the lines, so to speak. These institutions are also training obedience, training you for the workforce to fit into capitalism, and it makes sense that someone like Chloe wouldn't fit in very well into a system like this. I remember when I was in school, for the longest time, I thought I was stupid because I didn't do well in school, and I had a hard time focusing and understanding instructions due to my autism and my undiagnosed ADHD. When I was a little kid, I used to love school. Coincidentally, I also used to love science most of all, but because of the way school operates, I, as a neurodivergent person, as a disabled person, got very burnt out by school very quickly. In my experience, schools don't handle mental health crises very well, or even just general cases of poor mental health amongst students. We see this especially in the first Life is Strange game regarding Kate. So it doesn't surprise me that everyone at Blackwell has decided that Chloe is just a troublemaker and she doesn't care. There's also a very gendered way that many of the teachers and Principal Wells seem to view Chloe in both this game and the first Life is Strange. And you see this in comparison to Nathan, or even Drew. Principal Wells mentions that Drew's situation requires sensitivity, but apparently Chloe's doesn't. This gets even more interesting when you consider how race often factors into these biases, especially within academic spaces, and you consider Chloe as a white woman versus Drew as a black man. But the game doesn't really seem to engage with this, at least from my perspective. And then there's Nathan, whose mental health issues are ignored and mishandled as well, but the school seems very content to let him off the hook countless times and even bury his real school file. Now, obviously, this is most likely due to Nathan's family being the Prescotts and basically owning Blackwell. But I feel like this also speaks to something I've seen a lot in academic spaces, and basically everywhere, if I'm being honest. Men, particularly white men, are allowed to be flawed and make mistakes. Neurodivergent men are allowed to display the most toxic sides of their disabilities and be coddled for it. This is something I saw constantly in the special ed spaces that I occupied as a kid in school, which is why I particularly dislike and disagree with Samantha's framing of comparing Chloe and Nathan, telling Chloe that they aren't that different.
Your dark sense of humor reminds me a lot of Nathan's. Actually, the two of you are really similar.
What the hell does that mean?
I'm serious. You're both artistic and surprisingly sensitive. You've been through a lot, and a lot of people unfairly judge you for it.
But what she's overlooking is the fact that Chloe and Nathan are in completely different situations because they occupy completely different spaces in this world. Chloe's experiences, as we've discussed in this video, are shaped by her gender and class position, and so are Nathan's. You cannot remove disability and one's experience with disability from those other factors, which is why Chloe and Nathan cannot and should not be compared in this way in an effort to make it seem as though they're more alike than they are different. The first game makes this even more blatant, as it shows how Nathan enacts violence on Chloe and other women and is able to get away with it until you choose the wrong ending. If you choose to sacrifice Chloe, and Nathan is arrested for her murder. Granted, this is of course merely a performance of the justice system, because we all know someone of Nathan's background and means will probably not have to face much, if any, jail time. And even if he did, just throwing him in prison isn't going to fix anything, or induce real change, both within Nathan and within larger society as a whole. But that's a discussion for another video. Chloe and other neurodivergent women suffer under the violence men like Nathan perpetuate in response to their own suffering. While Chloe can definitely be abrasive and rude at times, lashing out and saying hurtful things, often in arguments with her mother, she definitely doesn't lash out with physical violence like Nathan. This clear difference in their behavior is explored excellently in the Game Assist video essay I mentioned earlier. Sure, Chloe may have beheaded a mannequin and beat the living shit out of an old junker, but that's not even remotely the same as being violent towards another living person. Chloe is blamed for the fight between Nathan and Drew, even though she was trying to defuse it in her own way and stick up for Nathan. Skip approaches her afterwards, not Nathan or Drew, but Chloe, and regards her with suspicion. Then there's the fact that Victoria basically gets away scot-free with committing plagiarism by copying Chloe's answers, even though they were incorrect, whereas Chloe is blamed for trying to sabotage her. A lot of this is implied to be because Chloe already has committed repeated infractions, so Principal Wells is less inclined to trust her or hear her out, as well as Victoria having Nathan speak for her on her behalf. But in my opinion, therein lies the problem with the carceral way the school system is designed, as well as the problem with the carceral justice system as a whole. The idea that your mistakes count against you, like some kind of point system. And at a certain point, your word and circumstances or point of view just have no worth anymore. Neither does your freedom or your rights. Not to mention making people afraid of punishment in order to make sure they follow the rules is not a good way to foster a genuine desire to do good in people, or the desire to coexist within a community. But Wells's attitude towards Chloe and her relationship with Blackwell has a lot to do with the way the Academy functions as an institution that needs to protect itself from madness. Margaret Price argues in Mad at School that, quote, "The necessity of passing for survival perpetuates the conventional view of Academy as an ivory tower, an immaculate location humming with mental agility and energy, only occasionally threatened from the outside by the destructive force of insanity." End quote. This quote is speaking about the nature of passing or masking in academic spaces in order to survive, and how an unfortunate consequence of this is that it perpetuates this idea of the Academy as a place where madness doesn't belong or doesn't exist. But the mention of the ivory tower, threatened only from the outside by destructive forces of insanity, is deeply significant and relevant to Chloe's experiences at Blackwell. Wells is treating her like something infectious that he needs to protect the sanctity and cleanliness of Blackwell from. He behaves as though Chloe's recklessness, her bad behavior, her so-called dirty image, is tainting Blackwell, as if she is poisoning it with her madness, so she must either be fixed or promptly disposed of. We see this continuing of framing Chloe like a problem rather than a person. In the first game, we see Chloe's permanent record, and the summary states that, quote, "Chloe is a problematic student, and even though Chloe is an intelligent student with potential, she chooses to squander it on empty rebellion against a non-mandatory institution," end quote. This makes me so angry for a number of reasons. Mainly just the utter lack of concern for Chloe as a human being, or what she might be going through, choosing to see cries for help as empty rebellion, and describing her as problematic. But once again, this is typical. When I was going through really bad depression and burnout due to masking my autism nonstop, my school was pretty unhelpful. I was consistently spoken to as if I was doing something wrong, rather than a person in pain and in need of help. I was constantly interrogated, rather than sympathized with. It is also mentioned in Chloe's file that she's had run-ins with the police. And if you talk to the cop at the diner as Max in the first game, he'll confirm that, with some more ableist language and framing Chloe as a problem, talking about how he feels sorry for Joyce for having to put up with Chloe. Now obviously this doesn't surprise me at all, because neurodivergent people, or disabled people in general, are often profiled by the police, especially neurodivergent people of color. But there was one thing he said in particular that I thought was interesting.
Then you know she's a hand.
No, I think she's just had some bad luck.
You have to create your own good luck. I think Chloe would rather destroy.
Okay, so first of all, fuck this man and fuck all cops. But I wanted to comment on how I think this points to the way people demonize the actions of neurodivergent people when they don't understand them, because they've become an inconvenience, or are too big and scary. Not to mention saying that someone like Chloe, quote, needs to make her own luck, end quote. Essentially blaming her for her problems and implying that she just isn't trying hard enough is a classic ableist mindset, not to mention very classist as well. The idea that you just need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and make things better for yourself. It completely ignores the reality of systemic oppression in this society and how capitalism shapes people's lives. But also I think in some ways Chloe does want to destroy. Chloe wants to destroy the things that are hurting her. She's angry at the world because the world hasn't been treating her fairly or kindly. She may lack the nuanced understanding of what exactly is causing this or what those systems of power look like, but she knows she's experiencing the effects of them. As I said before, Chloe is smart, actually. She knows that there are certain things in this world that should be destroyed, and of course that would make a cop uncomfortable. Now, I'm not trying to completely excuse all of Chloe's behavior, but I think it's fair to point out that she clearly has terrible coping mechanisms, and has no real tangible way to manage or deal with her emotions. It's mentioned in Chloe's diary that she tried therapy before, but it didn't really help, which is actually more common than some people might realize. Sometimes it can take a while to find a therapist that works for you based on your specific issues, especially if you have unprocessed trauma. Even more significantly, if you read Chloe as having undiagnosed BPD, then it makes sense that traditional methods of therapy might not work for her. As someone who is notoriously, quote, difficult to treat, unquote, I am all too familiar with how finding the right medication or therapist can be a challenge. But sometimes what's even more challenging is the way people will label you as being difficult, or just not trying hard enough to get better. And that's not even considering the fact that better looks different for different people. And we should be mindful of psychiatry's aims to fix people, rather than improve overall happiness and well-being, or the way certain therapists might not consider societal and systemic factors, and how they play a role in someone's mental health. But Chloe isn't being given patience or grace by anyone in her life, except for Rachel, even when it's blatantly obvious that she isn't okay. Not once throughout the entire game does anyone Chloe is close to or even somewhat friendly with bring up the topic of mental illness or therapy in a serious way. Wells mentions Blackwell's counseling services to her when he sees her black eye, but this is optional dialogue based on whether you choose to attack Sheldon at the mill or run away. Not to mention it feels disingenuous on account of the fact that most of the time he speaks to her like a criminal and treats her like a problem. So it makes sense that Chloe doesn't trust him. Samuel brings up the fact that Chloe isn't okay and tells her that it's okay not to be okay, but it's hard to fault Chloe for not taking this seriously, seeing as she doesn't really know him. And that's it. No one else says anything. Not once does Joyce ask Chloe, do you want to try seeing a different therapist? Or better yet, what do you need from me? How can I, as your mother, help you and support you better? There are notes in Kate's file in the first game about the school counselor meeting with her and expressing concern for her mental well-being, but there's no mention of anything of this nature in Chloe's file. And this is probably due to a number of reasons, but fundamentally I would argue this is because Chloe has surpassed the reasonable levels of mental illness in women. She's being irresponsible and abrasive, using drugs and breaking her mother's rules, blowing off classes, and even getting kicked out of Blackwell. She isn't the perfect wounded victim. She's problematic. And this framing of Chloe by a society who either seeks to dispose of her or tries to get her to just fall back in line and behave is most definitely having an effect on Chloe and her mental well-being. She clearly has a very negative view of herself in both games, not to mention clearly doesn't value her own life, given how willing she is to put herself in life-threatening situations or dangerous situations in both games. Sera from Game Assist brought up a significant point regarding Chloe and the junkyard, and how she feels so at home there, most likely due to the fact that she sees herself as broken and discarded, unwanted, just like the items left at the junkyard. She is perceived as trash and treated like trash, so she feels most at home amongst the trash, and I think this definitely rings true. The game continues this comparison with Chloe and her truck. Not to say Chloe is broken or needs fixing, but perhaps more along the lines of her needing more love, just like the truck. After the therapy session with Rachel, Chloe writes in her diary about fixing cars and fixing brains, and describes therapy as popping open the hood and getting your hands dirty, thus comparing herself to a car. It follows, then, that Chloe putting time and dedication into fixing the truck and getting it running again could be read as a metaphor for what Chloe needs to heal. She needs someone to put time and energy into loving her. Obviously, this metaphor is not flawless because Chloe is, in fact, not a car. She is a person. And it goes without saying that human brains are much more complicated than engines. However, I still think it's significant regarding Chloe's clear self-dehumanization and her connection to the junkyard. People both in-game and in the fandom can criticize Chloe for not taking responsibility as much as they want, but at the end of the day, if people keep making no effort to meet Chloe where she's at, or listen to her and try and understand her feelings, if people make no effort to try and help her learn to deal with her emotions in a healthy way, and if Joyce is just going to keep trying to ignore Chloe's feelings or chastising and blaming her for having them in the first place, and if everyone's just going to keep treating her like an obstacle or a problem or a burden instead of a human being who is in pain, then respectfully, what the fuck do you expect is going to happen? Now, we could talk a lot in regards to Elliot's problems and what he might be going through because, dear God, the man is not well. But this is a video about neuromisogyny, so I want to focus on the particular ways Elliot harms Chloe and why this sort of pattern feels so familiar to me. There's a pattern in both media and real life of neurodivergent or mentally ill women being treated as manic pixie dream girls, as victims to be saved or unsolvable mysteries. I've pointed out this trend before, particularly with autism, because that's what I have the most experience with. But this can be true for all sorts of neurodivergent female characters and real women. The manic pixie dream girl trope is this female stock character who seems to exist only to lighten up the male protagonist's life and get him to have fun. She's a weird, quirky girl who seems to behave and talk in strange and bold ways. She's not like the other girls. A lot of autistic women, as well as neurodivergent women in general, and some non-binary people such as myself, have drawn parallels between the characteristics of manic pixie dream girls and certain neurodivergent women, often autistic, ADHD, and sometimes those with BPD, as well as the parallels between the way we are perceived and treated by men. A lot of people see us as mysteries but don't bother to dig deeper and figure out who we actually are because that would spoil the illusion, or they just don't care about who we actually are. I keep coming back to the quote from Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind.
You guys think I'm a concept, or I complete them, or I'm gonna make them alive. But I'm just a fucked up girl who's looking for my own peace of mind. Don't assign me yours.
This sums up how I feel about how some people view me as a neurodivergent girl, particularly as an autistic girl, and how I know a lot of other neurodivergent people feel as well. And I think this relates to Chloe, specifically the situation between Chloe and Elliot, pretty well. If you go into his room in episode 2, you can find poetry written about Chloe and his feelings for her. A lot of it presents with an overall theme of Chloe needing to be saved, which is another common theme with disabled people in general, especially disabled women. Lots of abled people, especially men, fancy themselves as the white knight, swooping in to rescue us from a life of suffering and darkness, being the only ones brave enough to take it all on. If you combine the way women are infantilized in general with the way disabled people are infantilized, you end up with a pretty disastrous combination. His poems also paint Chloe as something mysterious and dark, dangerous but in an enticing way, a sort of branch off of the manic pixie dream girl. He writes about how nobody sees her, but he can, feeding into the fantasy he clearly has of being capable of saving her from herself. It's also worth mentioning that girls are definitely capable of doing this too, and I have seen it before a lot with the whole "I can fix him" trope. But the gender dynamics are what's interesting here. Elliot views Chloe with an air of infantilization that's clearly gendered in the way he calls her childish in one of his poems. This trend of seeing women as children compared to men is prominent, especially with other factors of marginalization coming into play. For me personally, my experiences with gender involve me being both infantilized and demonized depending on what the situation calls for in people's eyes. And this is also clearly true for Chloe. Elliot clearly has this idea that he knows what's best for Chloe, especially in regards to Rachel. The frustrating thing is, in some ways, he does have a point. He can recognize that Rachel has significant privilege over Chloe due to her being from a wealthy family and a straight-A student. If you speak to him in the parking lot, he mentions how typical it is that Rachel either got a lesser punishment or no punishment, depending on how you play the game. You could supposedly make the argument that Rachel is manipulating Chloe and her feelings for Rachel in order to get her to do what she wants, and in order to find her mother. However, I don't personally buy that. Rachel wouldn't have asked Chloe to run away with her if she didn't want Chloe with her. She could have just taken off by herself. Yes, there is the issue of the car, but it really isn't that hard to just get on a bus. Kate Marsh was going to do it in the first game, and Rachel clearly has enough money. More than Chloe. Involving Chloe in everything and asking her to skip school with her, even if she wasn't upfront with the details at first, shows a desire to have Chloe with her and have her involved. I choose to believe that even if Rachel isn't always the best communicator, something that's understandable seeing as she's a literal teenager, she still cares about Chloe. Elliot's clear obsession with Chloe becomes obvious when he follows her to the Amber's house and confronts her about Rachel. We as the player already knew Elliot was following her due to the "You are about to die" illustration in one of his poems from episode 2, as well as the searches on his computer showing that he was looking up the meaning of the Illuminati eye. However, this takes things to an even creepier and downright threatening level. He immediately gets frustrated with Chloe, raising his voice and even becoming violent as he insists that Rachel is the one who is bad for her. Rachel is the one who is dangerous.
No! You need to listen to me. What has your relationship with her gotten you?
You don't know what you're talking about.
First night you hang out, what happens? You end up in a fight.
I can see why you'd think that, but it wasn't her fault.
It's never her fault. That's the point.
Stop suggesting that she's somehow bad.
The next day she convinces you to skip school. Magically, she barely gets in trouble.
I took the fall because I wanted to. Rachel tried to protect me.
Yet somehow, it all worked out for her in the end, as usual.
Once again, he may have a slight point about Rachel getting Chloe into trouble, but he presents all of this without the proper context and makes it seem as though it's all Rachel's fault. His framing of Rachel and Chloe's relationship with her as dangerous and toxic plays into queerphobic and lesbophobic narratives, as well as playing into tropes about queerness being linked to criminal activity and deviance. He also acts like Rachel is brainwashing Chloe and leading her astray from good, clean, heteronormative morals. This narrative of the queer woman as a deviant, manipulative monster leading the nice, innocent straight girl astray into a life of corruption is very common in a lot of movies and TV shows, especially during the age of the Hays Code. The Hays Code was a set of guidelines imposed on the film industry from 1934 to 1968 to prevent, quote, profanity, nudity, graphic or realistic violence, sexual persuasion, and rape. This same queerphobic narrative is also employed by James Amber, but in reverse, this time casting Chloe as the deviant who is corrupting Rachel. And yes, obviously his comments are based in classism and ableism as well, but it's hard for me personally to deny that his words at the dinner table, as well as his entire attitude towards Chloe, and the way that he phrases his concern over their friendship, feels loaded to me as a queer person. Depending on which slot these men or various other people in the game want to fit Chloe into, she's either the villain of the story or the victim. She's the aggressive, unstable, deviant woman, a criminal, or the helpless, lost and broken girl who needs to be saved. Nowhere in either of these scenarios is there room for Chloe the person, Chloe the messy, multifaceted human being. So, now that we've spoken about Chloe and how this game engages with the neuromisogyny she experiences, let's talk about Sera. I have very strong feelings about Sera as a character, both for political and very personal reasons. And I won't even try to pretend that this essay isn't deeply personal as well as biased. But there is actually no such thing as an objective, unbiased opinion. We are all shaped and influenced by our experiences in this world. We are introduced to Sera as a solid character, arguably by James, in the beginning of episode 3, seeing as how we didn't really know anything about her before then. Just her name and the fact that she was kissing James at the Overlook and that Frank had seen her around, causing trouble for everyone. The reveal that she is in fact Rachel's biological mother casts her in a very different light. Not that this changes or makes up for the fact that she was kissing a married man, or the much more damning fact that James cheated on his wife, and the woman being Rachel's biomom doesn't erase that. Side note, something that has always confused me about the writing of this game is the way the cheating gets completely brushed off because it was a one-time thing, and Sera is Rachel's mother. Also, the use of a term like real mother feels kind of insulting to Rose, the woman who has actually been raising Rachel for the past 16 years. But I am not an adoptee, so that's all I'll say about that for now. But it does change her intentions regarding meeting up with James. She wants to meet her daughter. James then proceeds to tell Rachel his version of events, and it is incredibly significant that he is the one who is allowed to tell Sera's story. People often say that history is written by the victors, and I would argue the same is true for stories about marginalized people. The narrative is written by those in power, those who have an interest in controlling what the truth is and what it means. You see this all the time with stories about disabled people in particular. Abled people will constantly talk over us, constructing their narrative of who we are and who they want us to be, what they want us to be, what they want us to represent. And we see the same tactic in play here with James and Sera, as James gets to construct this narrative of her as the morally bankrupt and irresponsible addict, who only ever cared about herself, as well as casting himself as the hero. I think it's interesting how James particularly talks about how he thought becoming a mother would fix her, essentially curing her of her addiction and whatever was driving her to look for that escape she found in drugs in the first place. It is clear here how the sexist myth of women who have something wrong with them, i.e. queerness, being gender non-conforming, non-compliant, an activist, a rebel, not conforming to society's version of a proper woman, just needing to settle down and get married and have kids, was driving James's beliefs back then, and is still driving them now. Women, or people who are perceived as such, who don't want kids are also often seen as fundamentally broken or having something wrong with them. It's scary when you take into account how this narrative so easily can be used to manipulate and hurt neurodivergent women in particular. Women who don't conform naturally because of how our brains work, who often don't have the same societal values because we have a different understanding of social norms and what's important. Not to mention, as I stated earlier, it's easier to strip someone of their humanity and their autonomy, easier to point the finger and yell crazy when that person is neurodivergent or disabled in some way. Now, I don't know if Sera herself is neurodivergent. We do see some signs that she could potentially be categorized as something, especially based on her desire to escape and not exist in reality. But that could be the result of a number of things. For example, not fitting into heteropatriarchy the way she's supposed to. And I also don't think it really matters. I would argue, regardless, she still experiences neuromisogyny and is subjected to the dehumanizing way disabled people are treated in general. There is some discourse surrounding whether addicts and alcoholics should be considered disabled or neurodivergent or not. And while I understand some people's reluctance to call addiction a disability, I do think that in the framework of our ableist society, it can be. Not to mention how addiction is absolutely a disability politics issue, purely based on how many disabled people become addicts, and how many different types of neurodivergences seem to increase your risk of developing substance abuse issues. For example, research has found that autistic people are twice as likely to develop an addiction. A diagnosis of ADHD added to the mix makes it 8 times more likely. I couldn't find any data specifically for people who just have ADHD and not autism, but WebMD states that ADHD is 5 to 10 times more common in adult alcoholics than it is in people without the condition. I have both, and when I look at those stats, it's easy to feel like I never really stood a chance. I have struggled with abusing alcohol and binge drinking ever since I was 14 years old. It took me some time, but now I think I can admit that I am an alcoholic. Side note, I'm really not sure why the previous study decided to look at the stats of people with ADHD amongst alcoholics and people suffering from substance abuse instead of the other way around, but whatever, you do you, I guess. I also don't want you to take any of this medical research completely at face value. And what's amusing about the research found on these topics is that most researchers, who I'm assuming are neurotypical, will theorize that the disorder itself is the cause of our high addiction rates. They recommend ASD treatment, an oxymoron if I ever heard one because you can't actually treat or cure ASD, to be improved upon and taken more seriously. As for ADHD, it is found that ADHD is often comorbid with depression, so researchers will suggest treating the depression as a solution for the problem of addiction, often not taking into account why so many people with ADHD often develop depression. This is yet another case of the narrative being told by those who are in charge, those who have the wrong story. No one thinks to ask themselves why groups of people who constantly experience social rejection, ridicule, and alienation, those who are forced to live in a world not designed for them, a world that makes them feel lazy or broken or weird for being themselves, a world that teaches us to mask in order to fit in and survive, why would those people in particular have such high rates of addiction and substance abuse? Gee, I wonder. This is what happens when you don't actually talk to neurodivergent people. But regardless, I don't think it actually matters in particular why Sera was using drugs or why she became an addict in the first place. Maybe she was just unhappy in her current situation. Maybe she didn't want to get married and have a baby, but she felt like she had to. Maybe she was just sick and tired of living under a capitalist hellscape. Because whatever her exact circumstances were, it doesn't justify the way James treats her in this game, or the way he talks about her.
Eventually, I saw her for who she really was. A destructive person. Someone who could never be satisfied by anyone or anything. Even the love of her own daughter.
Society in general tends to view addicts as horrible people who choose to be addicts because they're lazy, selfish, or bored. This fundamentally ignores the reality of the world we live in and how exploitative and destructive capitalism is. It ignores the fact that this world is designed to break you, to treat you as an object or a number rather than a person. You're just another cog in the money-making machine to the people in power, and when that cog breaks, it's promptly disposed of like trash. The government doesn't want people to think of themselves as being closer to being houseless or an addict than they realize, even though it's often true. So many people, so many families are just one paycheck, one bad day away from becoming one of the undesirables. Not to mention, some drug addicts are seen as perfectly valid in the eyes of society, depending on cultural norms. It all depends on your privilege and your circumstances. White middle-class wine moms are allowed to get trashed at their fancy brunches and get away with being seen as causing drama or just being messy, but not an addict. Not one of those people. Why? Because they're not poor? Because they're not houseless? Because they don't look the part? Not to mention how binge drinking has become so heavily normalized within our society, particularly Western society, which is probably how I've gotten away with it for so long. The truth is, the people in power have an interest in perpetuating this narrative that all addicts are bad people, and it's an individual problem caused by the individual's own poor decision-making, because it means that they don't have to do anything about it. The government doesn't have a responsibility to try and fix the problem if the problem is simply poor individual character. This is very similar to the way disabled people are often blamed for our own shortcomings and told we just need to try harder. This is why, regardless of whether you believe addiction should be considered a disability, it is a disability issue. I would also argue that the growing popular narrative that addiction is an illness that drives people to abuse drugs or alcohol isn't super helpful either, because it fundamentally ignores the systemic factors that drive people to abuse substances. It ignores the role capitalism plays in manufacturing addiction, just like it plays a role in manufacturing mental illness. This is not to say that those experiences aren't real. The things you are feeling and experiencing are real. But to act as though addiction is just an isolated biological reality is flawed in my opinion. This narrative of illness still treats drug and alcohol use and abuse as a morally bad thing. It's this idea that you have done something bad, but it isn't your fault because you have an illness. I believe that in order to fully destigmatize addiction, We need to destigmatize substance abuse as well as understanding all the reasons why it occurs. There are harm reduction efforts in places like my home province of BC that aim to both reduce drug overdoses and destigmatize drug use, as well as response training and consumption supervision. The BC Centre for Disease Control describes harm reduction as follows, quote, "Harm reduction minimizes harms related to substance abuse and sexual activity. Harm reduction services help prevent HIV, hepatitis C, illness, infection, and overdose." End quote. It also involves providing people with sterile needles as well as safe methods of disposal, and providing people with harm reduction supplies such as naloxone kits, which is a medication designed to reverse the effects of opioid overdose. I don't have personal lived experience with harm reduction programs, but I can definitely see why this is a good idea, especially when you consider how for so many people abstinence isn't an option. James plays on this narrative that Sera is a bad person who tricked him into thinking otherwise. He tells the story this way, making sure to mention that Sera hurt Rachel, when in reality she got high while she was supposed to be watching her and didn't notice her crying, which, don't get me wrong, is still bad. That is still child endangerment, but James frames it as an act of choice that directly caused Rachel physical harm, which simply isn't true. A lot of people are quick to jump to the bad mother accusation in situations like these, without considering why the situation took place and what led to it, instead of focusing on the fact that Sera needed help and probably didn't mean to cause her daughter harm. James immediately makes a snap decision in that moment that Sera can never be trusted around Rachel again, that she is actively dangerous to her, and he takes off with Rachel. It is unclear based on the way the game only shows us so much and the way it is framed from James's perspective, if he even told Sera what he was planning on doing after she sobered up, or if he even stayed with her to make sure she was okay before leaving. So it is entirely possible that Sera woke up to find her husband and child gone with no explanation. James does mention that Sera is in town because she informed him that she was sober now and wanted to see Rachel, but he tells Rachel quite firmly that it cannot be, and frames it as if it is his decision to make instead of Rachel's. He also leaves out all kinds of things that would strengthen Sera's case that she should be allowed to meet her. For example, when Chloe is looking around James's office, she finds emails from Sera to James about James sending someone, presumably Damon, to talk some sense into her, i.e. threaten her. She also finds letters from Sera to Rachel, trying to establish contact that James clearly never showed Rachel. It's clear in all of these letters how much she wants to meet her and how much Sera regrets losing her. It's also deeply depressing how she clearly blames herself for everything. She has internalized James's and society's narrative of her, that she is a bad mother and a bad person. An ableist narrative. James also mentions that he has been sending Sera money every month in exchange for keeping away from Rachel all these years. He frames this as Sera caring more about the money than Rachel, which is bullshit. A woman struggling to survive addiction and capitalism on her own is obviously going to take handouts in any way she can. That's just common sense, and it has nothing to do with how badly she wants to see her daughter. But Chloe finds a whole stack of void checks in James's office, showing how she stopped cashing the checks about a year ago, which of course James didn't mention. She also finds a letter from a lawyer Sera hired so she could meet Rachel. The letter clearly informs James that he is breaking the law by not allowing Rachel's lawful mother to have contact with her, a letter that James was clearly ignoring. I think it is incredibly significant that Chloe is the one who finds all of this information. James is the one who first tells the story, his version. James presents his version, his narrative, and then Chloe is the one who uncovers the truth, or at least some of it. Sera's real story. Yes, Chloe is the playable character and the main character of this game, but she is alone during this section and therefore the first one to find all of this out. I think it is significant that she is a disabled woman, a neurodivergent woman, someone who has also been unfairly portrayed by certain people spinning their own version of events. The fact that Chloe gets to be the protagonist of this story at all is significant because, simply put, people like her, people like us, so rarely get to be in charge of our own stories. So rarely do we get to be the protagonist or the hero of the story. And even when we are, often the clear bias of the writing shows that it was never really about us. Simply put, Before the Storm feels like a game that was made by people who care about Chloe. So it feels like a game that was made by people who care about me. I'm not saying that there aren't issues. One of the things in particular that bothers me is the fact that in this game, you as Chloe don't really have the option to challenge James's ableist and biased view of Sera and interrogate it properly. It really is a flaw in the writing. She does question him, but not with enough force in my opinion. However, I may just be biased. In both Sera's letters to Rachel and her statements to Chloe later in the game, it is clear she is suffering from serious internalized ableism. Ableism that she has internalized from James and his treatment of her, as well as the general societal treatment of addicts. After Chloe passes out and comes to in the wreckage of the old mill, Sera tells her adamantly that Rachel can never know that James had her drugged and kidnapped. The way Sera talks about herself in this scene is heartbreaking for obvious reasons, but it's also painful to watch Chloe try and reason with her, knowing that she probably sees a lot of herself in Sera. She is also obviously projecting her feelings of abandonment from the death of her father, as well as Max leaving, onto the situation, but when she talks about how Rachel needs her, I think we can also read it as Chloe talking about how Rachel needs her as well. Chloe mentions how that feeling gives you strength you never knew you had. And I think this is interesting, particularly because it showcases how Chloe seems to get most, if not all, of her self-worth from other people and her relationships with other people. Whether it's Rachel or Max, helping someone she cares about clearly gives her a sense of purpose. And that in and of itself is not inherently unhealthy. However, when you find yourself having little to no regard for your own well-being to the point where you are willing to put yourself in mortal danger without a second thought for the people you love, one could argue that's a little concerning. As I already mentioned, it's clearly demonstrated in both this game and Life is Strange 1 that Chloe doesn't really place much value on her own life, seeing as she's so willing to offer herself up to save Arcadia Bay. The dialogue in this scene makes it clear that the reason Chloe is so ready to die for the sake of the so-called greater good is because she doesn't view it as much of a sacrifice. And there are direct parallels between this scene and the one with Sera. Both women clearly see themselves as burdens, and both women are so willing to dismiss the inherent value of their lives and their importance as people. For Sera, it's believing that she would only be a negative influence in Rachel's life, and for Chloe, it's believing that she has no right to live, especially not over the other people who are so much better than her in Arcadia Bay. And I know these beliefs didn't come out of nowhere. Yes, part of it is due to depression, but as I mentioned earlier, a lot of that depression is socially constructed due to systemic factors. And I know all too well how society is designed to make you feel this way as a disabled person. So many people seem too eager to blame the disability itself and its symptoms for the hardships disabled people face. But this fails to take into account how society and its ableist treatment of us creates a lot of, if not most of, our problems, especially our feelings of self-loathing and shame. There are two main ways of describing and thinking about disability in a societal context: the medical model and the social model. Taken directly from disabilitynottinghamshire.org, the medical model of disability says people are disabled by their impairments or differences. Under the medical model, these impairments or differences should be fixed or changed by medical and other treatments, even when the impairment or difference does not cause pain or illness. Whereas the social model of disability says that disability is caused by the way society is organized, rather than by a person's impairment or difference. It looks at ways of removing barriers that restrict life choices for disabled people. When barriers are removed, disabled people can be independent and equal in society with choice and control over their own lives. Now, there's a lot of good in the social model of disability, and a lot I personally agree with, but it doesn't really account for everything. For example, there are a lot of disabled people, particularly autistic people with higher support needs, who will always be disabled and affected by their disability. There are certain things you can't perfectly accommodate or make a non-issue just by fixing society or getting rid of capitalism. This is even true for some low support needs autistic people like myself. For example, you cannot turn off the sun. My sensory issues with heat and light will never really go away, even if you ban fluorescent lights in public spaces. I will always have issues with communicating with people and talking to people in general, regardless of how accommodating and understanding people can be. I cannot tell you how many times I have tried so hard to make it extremely clear what I'm trying to say in conversations, and I'm continuously misunderstood, and that often leads to arguments. and then I'm apologizing for something I didn't even say. So this is a conversation that involves a lot of nuance overall. But the way we are treated definitely plays a role in our quality of life. Odds are, Sera wouldn't see herself as broken, and Chloe wouldn't see herself as a burden if they weren't treated that way. If we didn't live in a world that isn't designed for disabled people to live, let alone thrive and be happy. If we didn't live in a capitalist society that is designed to break all of us. I also want to touch on another significant part of Sera's dialogue, that being what she says about Rachel. Sera, despite being so sure that she has no right to be Rachel's mother, or have a role in her life, seems to be very adamant about knowing what Rachel needs. I think this is interesting, particularly because, first of all, it's an excellent example of Sera internalizing James's ableist narrative, particularly his neuromisogyny towards her, but also because Sera appears to be mirroring James's denial of Rachel's agency. Sera is asserting that essentially, Rachel has no right to make her own decision on the matter of whether James should be forgiven, or whether she wants Sera to be a part of her life, and it's extremely infantilizing and unfair. Sera may say that it's not about her, it's not about James, and it's not about Chloe, it's about Rachel, but it's hard to take her seriously when she's clearly not trusting Rachel to make her own choices with all of the information. She's deciding that Rachel having her father in her life is more important than her knowing the truth and having Sera in her life, and that is making it about Sera, whether she intends to or not. She's making it about her and her own feelings about the situation. Sera frames this as choosing to protect Rachel or cause her even more hurt, but what she's overlooking is that James is the one who is hurting Rachel by having made these choices in the first place. He's the one who chose to kidnap and drug Rachel's birth mother, and putting the pain Rachel will feel when she learns of this on Chloe seems unfair at best and malicious at worst. I would also like to point out that a lot of harm can be done, and has been done, under the guise of protecting vulnerable people, particularly children and disabled people, and especially disabled children. Saying that you're doing something like lying for the sake of protecting someone or for their own good does not magically negate that harm, nor does it excuse the dehumanization of assuming you know best and robbing someone of their agency. In the final decision, the framing is particularly interesting. In your list of important decisions for episode 3, the picture for Tell Rachel Everything depicts Chloe leaning towards Rachel, the two of them facing each other. It creates a sense of intimacy and openness. It shows trust, a trust that has not been broken. Whereas if you choose to protect Rachel from the truth, a kinder way of describing lying to her, Chloe is facing away from her, with a clear look of guilt and regret on her face. The game appears to be showing a conflict between being close to Rachel and not telling her the truth about Sera, which makes sense. If James Amber has taught us anything, you cannot foster a healthy relationship on lies. The game provides you with the option to choose to echo the harmful actions of Rachel's ableist and misogynistic father, with the same excuses. Furthermore, not only are you echoing the actions of James, you are also, ironically enough, echoing the actions of David in both this game and Life is Strange. If you choose to protect Rachel from the truth, you are choosing to do so for her supposed own good. You are echoing the actions of those who have hurt Chloe, those who have exuded their power over her as a vulnerable, marginalized woman in the name of knowing what is best for her. By choosing to lie to Rachel, you are also upholding James's narrative that Sera cannot be trusted and is not committed to being in Rachel's life. If you, as Chloe, make the choice to protect Rachel from the truth, Chloe will tell Rachel that she couldn't find Sera, implying that she's already left town. Rachel clearly wants to go look for her again tomorrow, but the ending of the game clearly implies that they could not find her. Chloe also doesn't say anything about Sera's letters or the void checks, Sera's emails to James or the custody lawyer, any of it. Rachel remains ignorant of how hard Sera fought to meet her and also of her father's role in keeping her away. James gets to remain the hero of the story. Ironically, in this situation, going directly against Sera's wishes and telling Rachel the truth actively challenges the dehumanizing narrative against her, because it's not really her narrative. It's the one that James gave her, the one she internalized. Telling Rachel what really happened directly challenges it, along with James's neuromisogyny, and forces the truth into the light, for better or for worse.
You can do whatever you want, Chloe. You have the power.
Power. What is power? The first time I heard that line while playing this game, I was struck by it. There are two distinct types of power in this game series. Actual superpowers, which don't actually exist in the real world, as far as we know. And then there's the political power. The systemic power, if you will. and Chloe has neither, which I don't think is an accident. This is not to say that characters with superpowers have political power. This is definitely not the case. But I wholeheartedly believe in a theory we were all discussing in the Game Assist Life is Strange 2 live streams, that powers can work as a form of resistance, or even revolutionary justice. We see this in particular regarding Max and her power to save Chloe when she was supposedly marked for death. We see this in the storm, which very well may be Rachel's revenge, or Rachel's justice. Chloe in this game feels very uniquely powerless. And I think part of that is marked by the fact that she has no friend with time travel powers to come and save her this time. There is no Max Caulfield hiding in the shadows, ready to pull the fire alarm. It's just Chloe. Chloe and Rachel, two teenage girls that Arcadia Bay actively works to bury, either through negligence or direct action. Both of them have very little power, putting aside the theory for now that Rachel has some sort of fire powers. Although that does get interesting when you think about Rachel setting the tree on fire and how that's linked to her anger towards her father. But regardless, Chloe throughout this entire game remains for the most part powerless. She has no power over what happens to her. No power over what happens with her mom and David. No power over whether she gets kicked out of school or not. No power over the way people perceive her, and she certainly didn't have any power over what happened to her father. No. The only real power Chloe has, I would argue, is the power she's always had. Her voice. Chloe's ability to backtalk people in this game is used as a sort of stand-in for superpowers, and I think it's incredibly significant that it was this character that was given this sort of power, when she is so often powerless. Chloe's ability to backtalk is significant because, simply put, Chloe's voice matters. It is the voice of someone who is marginalized, someone who has been routinely silenced and dismissed. And I think the fact that she, as a disabled queer woman, as a mad woman, refuses to shut up and refuses to censor herself is an extremely important aspect of her character, as well as an extremely important aspect of this game. This game is full of Chloe's narrative. Chloe's voice. Not just her dialogue, but also her written voice in the form of her diary. And because you play as Chloe, you're constantly hearing her voice in her head. Your head, as she narrates her perspective on the world around her. A perspective that is so often lost in the noise and drowned out by those who would silence and dismiss it for being too loud, too harsh, or simply just too much. You cannot escape it in this game. You cannot escape her. In the Game Assist video essay I mentioned earlier, yes, I know, take a shot or mark your tallies or whatever you're doing, but I promise this has a specific purpose. Sera describes the line from the song Spanish Sahara, which plays in the Sacrifice Chloe ending, the ghost in the back of your head, as the ghost of Chloe.
The song Spanish Sahara by Foles builds slowly, telling us that Chloe is the ghost in the back of our heads. She is the ghost of the queer, disabled, working class woman that you have killed. She is the ghost of all of the queer, disabled, working class women that you are killing and will kill by preserving the dominant, queer-phobic, ableist, patriarchal, capitalist social order.
If Chloe is the ghost in the back of your head in Life is Strange 1, if you kill her, then I find it interesting, and maybe a little funny, that Chloe is the voice in your head, very much front and center and alive in this game. She's here. She matters. But there are other ways for disabled women to die. Let's just go with women right now, broadly speaking, or woman-aligned, because my gender situation is a goddamn mess. We die by our own hands, for one. We die from overdoses. We die because we're poisoned, little by little. Snuffed out by a society that saw us as disposable or some kind of misfortune, or a warning. Let this be a lesson to you, kid, Damon says. Make good choices, or you'll end up like her. And so, the story is written. Sera was an addict and she was selfish. She was a bad mother who never cared about Rachel, who only ever cared about herself, and she never tried to get in touch with her daughter. But Chloe knows the truth. Chloe, who people tell stories about as well. And maybe there's a part of her that even believes some of them. Because when you are told one version, the same version of a story over and over and over again, eventually you start to believe it, even if it directly conflicts with what you know in your heart to be true. Until eventually you pave over that knowledge and it completely disappears from view. Or, you tell your story. You tell the truth. Because the truth is, We deserve better. Chloe and Sera both deserve better. They deserve better than to be chastised and blamed, demonized and dehumanized, discarded and disposed of like trash in the junkyard by a society that has no place for women like them, for women like us, and certainly no sympathy. But we were here and we mattered. Our voices have power. Our stories have power. So write them down if you can, in whatever way you can. Write your name on the walls. Thank you so much for watching my very first official video essay. This has been such a labor of love for me for a really long time now, so if you enjoyed it, please feel free to give it a like and subscribe to my channel if you're interested in seeing more videos like this one. On screen are my socials, feel free to follow me, and I'll see you in the next one.